What's going on? Welcome in the Matt Bernier Show, DRFTV, live.drf.com, livestream.com, the Daily Racing Forms Twitter handle at DRF Inside Post, as well as the Daily Racing Forms Facebook page. My name is Matt Bernier. You can follow me on Twitter, at Bernier_Matt. This is the recap edition of the Matt Bernier Show, going back and taking a look at some big racing action from the weekend of September the 15th and the 16th. Grade 1 action galore, but most notably up at Woodbine, north of the border in Canada. We'll go over all those big races, as well as a few other ones, including Sands Point from down at Belmont Park. A brief stakes montage this weekend. We'll give you the weekend's best as far as Beyer speed figures are concerned, and then we'll also give you a little bit of a heads up what's to come this week here on DRF TV. If you are listening to this live, thank you for doing so. If you listen to a podcast, though, like most of you do, YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes, video.drf.com, as well as Spotify. And if you're over on YouTube, click that subscribe button, give us a thumbs up. You get all the latest as far as DRF TV is concerned with offerings and things of that nature. Give us a thumbs up as well while you're over there. And over on iTunes, write us a little review. Give us a positive rating. It's always greatly appreciated. I've had to change the camera angle a little bit just because something was going on with my neck. So you see my calendar in the back. If you think it's silly looking, then maybe I'll have to move it. But for the time being, just for some physical help, we'll move a little bit. Let's dive into the racing. Okay, right off at the top, we'll go with the big one up at Woodbine. This is the marquee event, the main event of the entire Woodbine meeting. We're going to take a look at the Grade 1 Rico Woodbine Mile, one-turn mile on the turf course. Field of 8 signed on. This race boiled down to a few different things. Leading into it, it looked like there wasn't a ton of speed signed on. That was even more evident when La Sardane, the filly, did not go against the boys. That left you with the field of 8, and it kind of felt like Oscar Performance, who was going to be forwardly placed. Tactically, he had a major advantage. The question was, what the heck happened in the Arlington Million most recently, and would he be able to rebound? If it's not him, who would it be? Would it be the eventual post-time favorite in Delta Prince, who we know what he's capable of? He likes Woodbine. He's had success at that one-turn configuration up there in the past. Ultimately, we got kind of a merry-go-round. Here's the stretch run of this year's Woodbine Mile.
Performance heads for home, joined by Mr. Havercamp on the outside. Right behind them, Delta Prince, Stormy Antarctic, Oscar Performance and Mr. Havercamp. Divisadero and Stormy Antarctic running on, Delta Prince behind. Oscar Performance in front. Oscar Performance and Mr. Havercamp neck and neck. And down in third, Stormy Antarctic, but it's Oscar Performance shrugs them off. A gate-to-wire winner. Oscar Performance by a length and a half, Mr. Havercamp, Stormy Antarctic and Delta Prince.
Oscar Performance gets the job done as the second choice at odds of 5-2 over Mr. Havercamp. The local hope beneath Eurico Rosa da Silva runs a game second at odds of 8-1, and Stormy Antarctic, one of the European invaders, runs third at odds of 15-1. Your beaten favorite Delta Prince runs fourth at odds of 2-1. Let's talk about Oscar Performance a little bit more. He's 8 of 14 lifetime, 9 times in the money. Over $2.3 million in career earnings, owned by Ammerman Racing LLC, trained by Brian Lynch, bred by Mrs. Jerry Ammerman in Kentucky, ridden to victory by Jose Ortiz, and you see the pedigree at the bottom of the horse card. He's by Kitten's Joy out of a theatrical mare named Divine Actress. No time form U.S. figures are in at the time of this being recorded, so we're only dealing with Beyer speed figures. Oscar Performance earns a 104 Beyer. You see the runner-up and the third-place finisher, Mr. Havercamp and Stormy Antarctic. They both come back to earn 100 Beyers. And then everyone else, it drops down a little bit, 98, 97, 95, 94, respectively. The story of this race, when you look at the chart, I mean, it's hard to argue with this. When you see the pace that was thrown up, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say that time form will probably have this on the slow side of things. Horses of this caliber, getting a quarter mile in 24-3, getting a half mile in 48-3, and sure, they picked it up a little bit, but even that third quarter, hitting that 6 furlong point in 11-2, for horses of this caliber, they're capable of going much, much faster. And Oscar Performance, when you let him do that, you give him an inch, he's going to take not only a mile, he'll take 5 miles. He's a very talented horse. Brian Lynch has done a great job. Again, this is a horse that you didn't know what you were going to get coming out of that Arlington Million, because it was just such an inexplicably poor performance, and he was eased, and you assumed everything was good if he was coming back here, but still, it's very difficult to trust horses off such poor efforts. Well, he put all that sort of to bed, all those fears. It's very difficult, though, if you're any of the other horses trying to come from off the pace. When you get a horse like Oscar Performance, who has the ability that he does, and if you give him that sort of soft pace situation, he's going to be able to fire home just as fast as you guys are. So when you look at these final quarter miles, Depending if you want to look at the incremental fractions in Formulator or you choose to look at the Trackist charts for Woodbine, they're slightly off here and there, but I mean, we're talking by hundredths of a second, not tenths or anything drastic. In unison, though, and sort of across the board, all of these fractions are telling you that the final quarter was in sub 22 for basically the entire field. When you get a horse like Oscar Performance who comes home in 21:63 according to Formulator, it's going to be very difficult if you're any of these other horses. A horse like, let's even use Stormy Antarctic, who was more mid-pack throughout. He comes home in 21:50. Any other time, that's going to be just an electric come-home time. But when they went as slow as they did, he really had no chance to make up any sort of ground. An impressive performance from Oscar Performance. Brian Lynch was quoted afterwards saying, "I thought Jose rode him beautifully, and his last quarter was sensational. It's nice to see him back, and it's a win and you're in, and we've got 6 weeks to the Breeders' Cup. Now we can take a deep breath and do the best we can to have him right on that day." This is a kind of horse where, again, he doesn't have to have the lead. He's shown that he can sit and be effective off of a target and go and get them. You always have to consider these horses dangerous. I mean, he reminds me a little bit from a tactical standpoint, like a Tepin, like a Wise Dan, those kind of horses that they can be up there relatively close to the front end, and they're going to finish with a serious late bid. Now, again, the question becomes, do you totally trust, first things first, do you totally trust that he's back? Because this, call a spade a spade, this was a soft trip. He ran great, but this was a soft trip. He had everything go his way. If you think he's back, that's great. But then you also have to factor in that he's coming out of a race that, things went perfectly for him. It's unlikely that they'll go perfectly for him in the Breeders' Cup Mile. The tactical speed and that tactical ability that he brings, that's going to make it a heck of a lot easier for him to pull a good trip than some of these other horses. But still, at the end of the day, you need to make decisions because he's going to be one of the choices in a race like that, the Breeders' Cup Mile. And coming off of a pretty cushy situation in the Woodbine Mile, that's for you to decide. At the end of the day, you can't argue. This was a very, very impressive performance from him. Thought Mr. Haverkamp ran very well. The connections have to be pleased. Stormy Antarctic obviously ran well. Delta Prince, to me, was the disappointment of the race because he had a really good trip. He sat in just behind, and I know the pace never came back to him, but he actually went backwards. He just never looked like he was really traveling well. Javier Castellano, the rider afterward, regarding Delta Prince, really disappointing. He didn't show up today for some reason. He was flat, had a nice, comfortable rhythm behind the winner, but when I asked him at the top of the stretch, he just didn't respond. We've seen this horse run better than this. I think perhaps you want to give him a mulligan at some point. But, again, to be fair, if I'm saying this about Oscar Performance, where you need to take a look and say, well, things went well and it all worked out for you, and maybe that's why I want to be a little bit leery or question if I want to use you next time. With Delta Prince, this was such a poor performance, even though he may have been a little bit compromised by the pace situation. I'd have to question if he shows up in a big race. Do I really want to get involved with him? A couple other horses, the ones toward the back. Lord Glitters, you don't want to hold this one against him again because he was coming over here and the pace just never materialized. He came home very, very quickly. I think you can say the same for Good Samaritan. The only problem with trying to say that for Good Samaritan, and I picked Good Samaritan in this race, there's still at least a question about can he actually still run. Now, he finished home, again, like everyone else, sub 22, and I think he was in that 22-2 sort of 21-2 final quarter range. So, I mean, he was coming home legitimately quick, but I do think there is that little sort of concern, can he run at all? We don't really know for certain. I'm inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt, and if he shows up in a spot, not the Breeders' Cup, but if he shows up somewhere else in a mile event, perhaps that'll be an instance where you can get an inflated number, and I think really that's what it boils down to. It's one thing to excuse a subpar effort if you're going to get a very, very square price in the next race. It's another thing to say, well, poor performance, I'll just give him the benefit of the doubt when you're going to be one of the favorites in the next spot. And ultimately, again, this game, all it does is boil down to value. You need to look at it and make a determination on your own as the handicapper. Call me crazy. I still think Divisadero has a chance in a race like the Breeders' Cup Mile, should they go there. This is a horse that was compromised again by the pace situation at the top of the lane. Looked like he was full of run. And you know what? He finished well. He came home, according to Formulator, in 21:72. I don't know that I want to hold this race against him first time in a configuration like this. First time he'd ever been up to Woodbine. He loves Churchill Downs, and if you give him more pace to run at, I think he's going to come with a late bid. I don't know if the connections are going to choose to go that far with him and go to the Breeders' Cup. I hope they do, because I think he still fits in there. I really do. And he'll be a giant price at that point. I mean, he was, 14-1 in this race. He was 10-1 in the 4-star Dave. You would assume he's going to be minimum 25-1 or greater in a race like the Breeders' Cup Mile, should they choose to go there. If they don't, obviously entirely understandable, and maybe you think he can't quite do it anymore. I'm not totally convinced just yet. If you give him pace and you get him at Churchill, I wonder if Divisadero is a horse that can spring a little bit of an upset, or at the very least maybe threaten to hit the board and spice up exotics. But this race boiled down to pace, making the race, and the pace setter being a very, very talented horse, and he's in great hands with Brian Lynch and Jose Ortiz aboard. Oscar Performance gets back to his winning ways with a 1-0 buyer in this year's Woodbine Mile, and it sounds like it is on to bigger and better things. He's probably going to be one of the favorites down at Churchill Downs here in a few weeks in the Breeders' Cup Mile.